Christmas morning arrived at Bellerive Plantation with all the ceremony befitting one of Louisiana's most distinguished estates. The year was 1847, and Henri Dufresne had every reason to celebrate. At 32 years old, he had inherited his father's sugar empire 6 months earlier, transforming himself from the younger son into the master of 3,000 acres and 170 souls. The mansion gleamed with imported crystal chandeliers brought from Paris at considerable expense, and the scent of roasted duck mingled with pine garland throughout the grand parlor. Outside, the December air carried an unusual chill for Louisiana, and frost had touched the edges of the fountain in the courtyard, creating delicate patterns of ice that caught the morning light. The household had been preparing for this day for weeks. The kitchen staff had worked through the night, producing elaborate dishes that would grace the long mahogany table in the dining room. The house slaves had polished every surface until it gleamed, hung wreaths on every door, and arranged candles in every window. It was a display of wealth and refinement that would have impressed even the most critical visitors from New Orleans society. But the gift waiting for him in the courtyard would unravel everything he believed about his family, his name, and himself. Henri descended the front steps of the mansion with the confident stride of a man who had finally come into his inheritance. His older brother, Philippe, had been groomed from birth to manage Bellerive, while Henri had been sent to study law in New Orleans, expected to make his own way in the world. But yellow fever had taken Philippe 3 years ago, and their father had followed him to the grave just 6 months past, leaving Henri as the sole heir to everything the Dufresne family had built over 3 generations. The transition had not been easy. The overseers questioned his authority, the neighboring planters watched for signs of weakness, and Henri himself struggled with the weight of responsibility. He had spent his 20s in the relative freedom of the city, arguing cases in court, attending theater performances, and enjoying the cosmopolitan pleasures of New Orleans. Now he was bound to this land, to these people, to a way of life he had never fully embraced. Charles Beaumont stood beside the fountain with the satisfied smile of a man who had chosen his gift well. Charles was Henri's closest friend from his New Orleans days, a successful cotton broker who had helped Henri navigate the complex business arrangements that kept Bellerive profitable. He was a few years older than Henri, already graying at the temples, with the easy confidence of someone born into wealth and position. "Merry Christmas, my friend," Charles announced as Henri approached. "I know you've been looking for someone skilled in household management. Your mother's old housekeeper passed away last spring, and I've heard you've been struggling to find a suitable replacement. This one comes highly recommended. Literate, well-mannered, trained in fine service. Her previous owner was settling debts in Natchez. The moment I saw her papers, I thought of you immediately." Henri's attention shifted to the woman standing beside Charles. She wore a simple grey dress, clean but worn, with careful mending visible at the cuffs and hem. Her hair was wrapped in a blue cloth that had seen better days, but the way she wore it suggested dignity rather than poverty. She couldn't have been more than 25, with features that suggested mixed heritage. High cheekbones that caught the morning light, amber-colored eyes that seemed to hold depths of unspoken experience, and skin the shade of honey in afternoon light. Around her neck hung a small silver locket, the only adornment she possessed, catching the light as she breathed. She stood perfectly still beside the fountain, her hands clasped before her, eyes fixed on the cobblestones. There was a stillness about her that intrigued Henri, a quality of contained presence that suggested she was accustomed to being observed, but had learned to retreat into herself, to become invisible while remaining physically present. Henri approached slowly, studying the woman with the practiced eye of someone raised to evaluate human property as casually as livestock. It was a skill he had never been comfortable with, even as a child. He remembered his father teaching him to assess the health and value of enslaved people by examining their teeth, their hands, their posture. The memory made him uncomfortable now, though he couldn't have articulated exactly why. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than he had intended. "Margot, sir." Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that suggested education beyond what most enslaved people received. There was a slight French inflection to her words, the kind that came from growing up in New Orleans rather than the rural parishes. "Margot," he repeated, testing the sound. It was a French name, not uncommon in Louisiana, but something about the way she pronounced it stirred an uncomfortable sensation in his chest. A memory, perhaps, or the ghost of one. Something just beyond the reach of conscious thought. "Look at me." She raised her eyes slowly, and in that moment, Henri felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Those eyes, that particular shade of amber flecked with green. He had seen them before. Every morning in his mirror, when the light caught his face at a certain angle. Every time he looked at the portrait of his father that hung in the library, the one painted when Etienne Dufresne was in his prime, before age and responsibility had carved lines into his face. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The shape of her face, slightly oval with a strong jawline. The set of her jaw determined but not aggressive. The way she held her head slightly tilted when listening, as if considering every word before responding. Even the small crease between her eyebrows when she concentrated, all of it echoed his own features with unsettling precision. His breath caught in his throat. Charles was saying something about her qualifications, about the family in Natchez who had owned her, about the excellent references she came with. But Henri barely heard him. His mind was racing, making connections he didn't want to make, seeing patterns he wished he could unsee. "Where were you born?" The question came out sharper than he intended, cutting across Charles's description of Margot's skills in household management. "New Orleans, sir, on Rue Dauphine." Her voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. She had noticed his reaction, had seen the shock in his face. Henri's hands went cold despite the mild morning air. His father had owned a townhouse on Rue Dauphine. He had kept it for decades, visiting frequently on business trips that sometimes lasted weeks. His mother had never questioned these absences, or if she had done so in the privacy of her own thoughts, choosing the easier path of willful ignorance. Henri himself had been to the house once, sent by his father to deliver papers to a lawyer when he was perhaps 15. He remembered very little of the visit: a courtyard with flowers, blue wallpaper with birds, a woman answering the door, a child peeking from behind her skirts. The memory crystallized with sudden, terrible clarity. The child had been perhaps 7 or 8, with curious amber eyes that had stared at him with unguarded interest. He had looked at her for perhaps 30 seconds before the woman, her mother presumably, had ushered her away. He had thought nothing of it at the time, had assumed she was the daughter of a servant or tenant. He had looked at his sister and not known her. "Who was your mother?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Margot hesitated, and for the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the memory of it. "Her name was Céleste, sir. Céleste Dubois. She died when I was 12. The name meant nothing to Henri, but the timeline aligned with terrible precision. He would have been 19 when Margot was born, away at university in New Orleans, focused on his studies and the social life of a young man of his class. His father would have been 53, still vigorous, still traveling to New Orleans regularly for business, still maintaining whatever secret life he had built away from Bellerive, away from his wife and legitimate children. Charles was watching this exchange with growing confusion, his smile fading into a frown. "Henri, is something wrong? If she's not suitable, I can arrange for her to be returned to the dealer. There's no obligation. I simply thought—" "No." Henri's voice came out hoarse. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing himself to sound normal, controlled. "No, she's fine. Thank you, Charles. It's a generous gift. Very generous indeed." But his mind was racing, calculating, trying to find some other explanation for what his eyes were telling him. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps many people in Louisiana had amber eyes and French features. Perhaps he was seeing connections that didn't exist, driven by guilt over the institution he had inherited, along with his father's wealth, looking for reasons to feel uncomfortable with a system that had enriched his family for generations. Yet even as he tried to rationalize it away, he knew, deep in his bones, in that place where truth lives before we find words for it, before we can shape it into something manageable, he knew. The woman standing before him, the human being his friend had just given him as property, wrapped up with a bow like a piece of furniture or a horse, was his sister. His half-sister, to be precise. Born to an enslaved woman his father had kept as a mistress, raised in a house his father had maintained for that purpose, educated with his father's money, and then, when the arrangement had ended for whatever reason, sold into the system like any other piece of property. And now she belonged to him. The law said she was his to command, to use, to dispose of as he saw fit. His sister was his slave. The thought made him physically ill. Charles was still talking, explaining the arrangements he had made, the price he had paid, the papers that would need to be signed. Henri forced himself to focus, to respond appropriately, to play the role of the grateful recipient of a thoughtful gift. He thanked Charles profusely, invited him to stay for Christmas dinner, and called for one of the house servants to show Margot to her quarters. As she followed the servant toward the house, Margot glanced back once, her amber eyes meeting his. In that brief moment of connection, Henri saw something that made his chest tighten, a flash of recognition, of understanding, of shared knowledge that neither of them could acknowledge. She knew, or at least she suspected. She had seen the resemblance just as he had made the same terrible connections. And now they were both trapped in a situation that neither of them had chosen, bound together by blood and law in a way that made any genuine relationship impossible. Before we continue with the story of Henri Dufresne and the sister he never knew he had, I want to hear from you. If you're enjoying this dark tale from Louisiana's past, please subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss our historical mysteries. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below telling me what state or city you're in. Now let's return to Bellerive Plantation, where Henri is about to discover just how deep his father's secrets run. Henri couldn't sleep that night. Christmas dinner had been a torturous affair, with Charles and several other guests from neighboring plantations filling the dining room with conversation and laughter, while Henri struggled to maintain the appearance of normalcy. He had watched Margot move through the room, directing the serving staff with quiet efficiency, and every glimpse of her profile had been like a knife to his chest. Around 3 a.m, unable to bear the darkness and his own thoughts any longer, he rose, dressed quietly, and went to his father's study. If there were answers to be found, they would be there, among the carefully organized ledgers and correspondence that documented 30 years of plantation management. The study was exactly as his father had left it. Henri had been unable to bring himself to change anything in the 6 months since Etienne's death. The massive desk still held his father's favorite pen, the one with the silver nib that he had used to sign every important document. The walls were lined with books, legal texts, agricultural manuals, histories of Louisiana and France. The air still carried a faint scent of his father's tobacco, a particular blend he had imported from Cuba. Henri lit the oil lamp on the desk and began his search. He started with the financial records, the leather-bound ledgers that his father had maintained with meticulous care. Etienne Dufresne had been a man who believed in documentation, in creating a paper trail that could withstand any scrutiny. Every expense was recorded, every transaction noted, every payment documented down to the penny. Henri traced backward through the years, looking for payments related to the Rue Dauphine property. He found them easily enough: monthly disbursements for property maintenance, occasional larger sums for furnishings or repairs. The amounts were substantial but not excessive, the kind of expenses one would expect for maintaining a townhouse in a fashionable part of New Orleans. But there were other payments too, regular amounts sent to someone identified only as CD in the ledgers. The payments had continued for 25 years, stopping abruptly 8 months before his father's death. The amounts varied, sometimes $50, sometimes 100, occasionally more. Over the years, they added up to a substantial sum, enough to support a comfortable lifestyle in New Orleans. 8 months. Margot had said her mother died when she was 12. If Margot was now 25, that meant Celeste had died 13 years ago. The timeline didn't match unless... Henri pulled out another ledger, this one containing copies of correspondence. His father had kept duplicates of important letters, organized by year, and filed with the same meticulous care he applied to everything else. Henri flipped through 1834, the year Margot would have been born, and found nothing unusual. But in 1835, he discovered a letter from a lawyer in New Orleans, confirming the purchase of a house on Rue Dauphine and the establishment of a trust for its maintenance. The letter was formal, businesslike, revealing nothing of the human story behind the transaction, but attached to it with a pin was a small piece of paper, folded many times until it was no larger than a postage stamp. Henry's hands trembled as he unfolded it, smoothing out the creases carefully. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, educated, the kind of penmanship that came from years of careful instruction. It read, "Etienne, she has your eyes. I have named her Margot, after your mother. I ask nothing for myself, but please, let her have a chance at something better than what I had. Let her learn to read. Let her know beauty. Let her believe, even for a little while, that the world can be kind." See, Henri sat back in his chair, the letter falling from his hands to the desk. His grandmother's name had been Margot. He had never known her. She had died before he was born, but he had heard stories. She had been educated in France, cultured, a woman of refinement who had insisted on bringing French tutors to the plantation for her sons. His father had spoken of her with reverence, had kept her portrait in his bedroom until the day he died, and he had named his daughter by an enslaved woman after her. The cruelty of it struck Henri like a physical blow. His father had acknowledged this child enough to name her after his own mother, had provided for her education and upbringing, had given her mother a house and financial support. But he had never freed them. He had never legitimized Margot's existence. He had kept her in the shadows, a secret to be maintained, a complication to be managed with money and distance. Henri continued his search through the night, finding more pieces of the puzzle. There were receipts for piano lessons, dated from when Margot would have been 6 years old. Bills for books, not just primers but literature, poetry, philosophy. Payments to a dressmaker for clothing that would have been appropriate for a young lady of society, not an enslaved child. His father had given Margot an education that would have been remarkable for any woman of that era, enslaved or free. But he had never freed her. That was the detail that Henri couldn't reconcile. The fact that gnawed at him as the night wore on and the lamp oil burned low. His father had possessed the power to grant Margot and her mother their freedom with a simple legal document. Louisiana law made manumission complicated, but not impossible. He could have done it. He had chosen not to. Why? The answer, Henri realized with growing bitterness, was probably mundane. Freedom would have required acknowledgement. It would have raised questions about who Margot was, who her father was. It would have threatened the careful social position that Etienne Dufresne had spent his life constructing. Better to keep them comfortable but controlled, provided for but powerless. Better to maintain the fiction that they were simply property he happened to treat well, rather than family he was too cowardly to claim. As dawn broke over Bellerive, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Henri found one more document. It was tucked into the back of a ledger from 1846, the year before his father's death. A letter from the same lawyer in New Orleans, informing Etienne that Celeste Dubois had passed away and requesting instructions regarding the disposition of her property and the future of her daughter. His father's response was clipped to the letter. "Continue the trust for the property. Make no changes regarding the girl. She is to remain as she is until further notice. E.D. She is to remain as she is, not free her, not ensure her safety, not find her a good situation, Just leave her as she is, enslaved, vulnerable, subject to whatever fate might befall her when the trust ended or circumstances changed, and circumstances had changed. The trust had apparently ended with his father's death, and Margot had been sold to settle some debt or close some account. She had passed through the hands of strangers, been evaluated and priced like livestock, and finally been purchased as a Christmas gift for her own half-brother. Henri thought of his father's funeral, the elaborate ceremony at the Catholic church in the parish seat. The governor had attended. The bishop had delivered the eulogy, speaking of Etienne Dufresne's character, his generosity, his contributions to Louisiana society. Everyone had praised him as a pillar of the community, a man of honor and principle. What would they say if they knew about the woman on Rue Dauphine, about the daughter he had kept as property, about the son who now owned his own sister? The sound of the household stirring pulled Henri from his thoughts. He heard the kitchen staff beginning their morning work, the clatter of pots and the murmur of voices. Somewhere in that activity was Margot, beginning her first full day at Bellerive, unaware that the man who now owned her was her brother. Or was she unaware? That was the question that had been gnawing at him all night. Had Celeste told her daughter the truth about her father? Or had she kept that secret, protecting Margot from the pain of knowing she was connected by blood to a man who would never acknowledge her? Henri needed to know, but he couldn't simply ask. The question itself would reveal too much, would expose his own knowledge and create a situation that neither of them could navigate safely. He would have to be careful, strategic. He would have to find a way to learn the truth without exposing his own. The morning after Christmas dawned gray and cold, with fog rolling in from the river and settling over Bellerive like a shroud. Henri emerged from the study exhausted, his eyes burning from lack of sleep and hours spent reading by lamplight. He had discovered so much, yet he still didn't know the most important thing, whether Margot knew who her father was, whether she had made the same connection he had when their eyes met in the courtyard. He found her in the main house, in the morning room that overlooked the gardens. She was directing 2 other enslaved women in the arrangement of furniture and the cleaning of the windows. She moved with quiet efficiency, her instructions clear and respectful. The other women responded to her with a deference that suggested she had already established her authority in the household hierarchy, despite having arrived only yesterday. "Margot," Henri said from the doorway, and she turned immediately, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. I'd like to speak with you." "In the library." He saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, quickly suppressed. She followed him down the hall, maintaining the proper distance, 3 steps behind, never beside, her footsteps nearly silent on the polished wood floors. It was a dance she had learned long ago, the careful choreography of servitude that kept enslaved people safe by making them invisible. The library was Henri's favorite room in the house, lined floor to ceiling with books his father had collected over the years. Many of them had never been read, purchased more for display than enlightenment, but Henri had always loved the space. The smell of leather and paper, the way the light filtered through the tall windows, the sense of being surrounded by knowledge and possibility. It had been his refuge as a child, when the brutality of plantation life became too much to bear. Now, it felt like a confessional. "Close the door," Henri said, and watched her hesitate before complying. He knew how this must look, the master calling a female slave to his private room, ordering the door closed. The implications were obvious and sickening. He needed to establish quickly that this was not that kind of conversation. "You said you can read?" Henri began, gesturing to the shelves around them. "Yes, sir. That's unusual. How did you learn?" "My mother arranged for lessons when I was young. She believed education was important." Margot's voice was steady, but Henri could hear the careful control in it, the way she was choosing each word with precision. "Your mother must have been remarkable." Something shifted in Margot's expression, a softening around her eyes that suggested genuine emotion breaking through the careful mask. "She was, sir. She was the most remarkable person I've ever known." She died believing I would have a better life than she did." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken irony. Celeste had died believing her daughter would be protected, would have the education and refinement to navigate the world successfully. Instead, Margot had been sold, had become property, had ended up in the household of her own brother. "And your father?" Henri asked, his voice carefully casual. "Did you know him?" The question was too direct, too personal, but he had to know. Margot's face became a mask again, carefully blank. "No, sir. My mother never spoke of him." It could have been the truth, or it could have been the answer she had learned to give, the safe response that protected both her and her mother's memory. Henri couldn't tell. He studied her face, looking for some sign, some indication that she knew more than she was saying. But she had learned too well how to hide herself, how to present only what was safe to reveal. "I see." Henri walked to the window, looking out over the grounds. The sugar-cane fields stretched to the horizon, brown and dormant in the winter cold. In a few months, they would be green again, growing toward the brutal harvest season that would consume every waking hour from August through December. The cycle never changed, year after year, generation after generation. "You'll work in the main house," he said finally, still looking out at the fields. "Household management, as Charles mentioned. You'll report directly to me, not to the overseer. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "You'll have your own room in the house, not in the quarters. You'll take your meals in the kitchen with the other house staff. You'll be treated with respect." He turned to face her, meeting her eyes directly. "And if anyone at all, treats you otherwise, you'll tell me immediately. Do you understand?" Margot's eyes widened slightly. It was a strange speech for a master to make to a newly acquired slave, and Henri could see her trying to understand what it meant, what he wanted from her. Was this kindness? Or was it something more complicated, more dangerous? "Thank you, sir," she said carefully, her voice giving nothing away. "That's all. You can go." She left quickly, and Henri sank into his father's chair, his chair now, feeling the weight of his inheritance pressing down on him like a physical force. He owned his sister. The law said she was his property, to do with as he pleased. He could sell her, punish her, use her in any way he chose, and no one would question his right to do so. The thought made him physically ill. He spent the rest of the morning in the library, trying to focus on the plantation accounts that required his attention. But his mind kept returning to Margot, to the impossible situation his father had created. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't simply free her, not immediately. The legal process for manumission was complex, requiring approval from the parish court, and a bond to ensure that the freed person wouldn't become a public charge. Any sudden manumission would raise questions, would invite scrutiny into the reasons behind it. And what would he tell people? That he had discovered she was his sister. That would require explaining how he knew, which would mean revealing his father's secret, which would destroy the Dufresne family's reputation. The scandal would be enormous. He would be ostracized from Louisiana society, his business relationships would collapse, and Bellerive itself might be threatened. But keeping her enslaved was unconscionable. Every moment that she remained his property was a moral outrage, a continuation of the injustice his father had perpetrated. Henri was trapped between two impossible choices, and he had no idea which path to take. The weeks following Christmas passed in a strange, tense equilibrium. Margot proved to be everything Charles had promised: efficient, intelligent, capable of managing the household with a skill that impressed even the longtime staff who had served the Dufresne family for decades. She moved through Bellerive like a ghost, present but not intrusive, always anticipating needs before they were spoken, managing the complex logistics of running a large household with apparent ease. Henri watched her constantly, looking for signs that she knew the truth. Sometimes he caught her staring at his father's portrait in the library, her expression unreadable. The portrait showed Etienne Dufresne in his prime, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in formal attire with his hand resting on a globe, a symbol of his worldly success and sophistication. The artist had captured something in his eyes, a certain intensity that Henri had always found unsettling. Once, Henri found Margot in the music room, standing before the grand piano that had belonged to his mother. Her fingers hovered over the keys but didn't touch them, as if she were remembering something from long ago, or perhaps restraining herself from doing something she desperately wanted to do. "Do you play?" Henri asked from the doorway, and she jerked back as if burned, her hands flying to her sides. "I did, sir. Once. My mother arranged lessons when I was young. Play something now." "Sir, I don't think that would be appropriate. I haven't played in years, and—" "It wasn't a request, Margot." Henri's voice was firmer than he intended, but he needed to know. Music was one of the few things that could reveal a person's true self, that could bypass the careful masks people wore and expose what lay beneath. She sat at the piano slowly, her posture rigid with tension. Her hands settled on the keys, and after a moment's hesitation, she began to play. The piece was Chopin, a nocturne, executed with a technical proficiency that spoke of years of serious practice. But it was the emotion in her playing that struck Henri, a deep, aching sadness that seemed to pour from her fingers into the music, filling the room with a grief so profound it was almost unbearable. The notes cascaded through the air, each one precise and controlled, yet somehow conveying a world of feeling. Henri found himself holding his breath, transfixed by the beauty and sorrow of it. This was not the playing of someone who had learned piano as a casual accomplishment. This was the playing of someone who had poured their soul into the instrument, who had found in music a refuge from a world that offered few other comforts. When she finished, the silence in the room felt heavy, oppressive. Henri realized his hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. He forced himself to relax, to breathe normally. "Where did you learn that?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "My mother's house, sir. We had a piano. She said music was important, that it could take you places you couldn't otherwise go." Margot's voice was soft, almost dreamlike, as if she were speaking from some distant memory. "She used to sit with me while I practiced, for hours sometimes. She said that no matter what happened, no matter where I ended up, the music would always be mine. No one could take it from me." "Your mother's house," Henri repeated, his throat tight. "On Rue Dauphine." Margot's hands stilled on the keys. "Yes, sir." "Tell me about it. The house." She was quiet for a long moment, and Henri thought she might refuse. But then she began to speak, her voice soft, almost dreamlike. "It was small, but beautiful. There were flowers in the courtyard, jasmine and roses. My mother kept them carefully, pruning them herself, talking to them as she worked. She said plants could sense love, that they grew better when you cared for them properly. The parlor had blue wallpaper with silver birds. I used to count them when I was supposed to be practicing piano. There were 47 birds on that wall. I counted them hundreds of times, and it was always 47. Henri's throat tightened. He had been to that house once, years ago, sent by his father to deliver some papers to the lawyer who managed the property. He had been perhaps 15, too young to understand what he was seeing, too naive to question why his father maintained a separate residence in the city. He remembered the courtyard, the flowers, the blue wallpaper with the silver birds. He remembered a woman answering the door, Celeste, though he hadn't known her name then, and a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 peeking around her skirts, staring at him with curious amber eyes. He had looked at his sister and not known her. They had been in the same room, had breathed the same air, and he had seen nothing but a child who meant nothing to him. "What happened to the house?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the documents he had found. "It was sold after my mother died. The lawyer said the arrangement had ended, that there was no provision for me to remain there. I was sent to work for a family in the Garden District. They were kind enough, considering. The mistress taught me fine needlework, and I was allowed to continue reading in my spare time. But when they fell on hard times 3 years later, they sold me to settle debts." She spoke matter-of-factly. as if describing the weather rather than the dissolution of her entire life. "I've learned that nothing is permanent, sir. Not houses, not arrangements, not kindness. Everything can be taken away." The resignation in her voice cut Henri deeper than anger would have. She had learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to accept whatever fate handed her, with quiet dignity. It was a survival strategy, he realized, a way of protecting herself from the constant disappointment of being property in a world that saw her as less than human. "You can play whenever you like," he said abruptly. "The piano is here. It sits unused. My mother played before she died. My father kept it maintained but never touched it himself. It should be played. Music shouldn't be silent." She looked up at him, surprise breaking through her careful mask. "Sir, the piano," he repeated. "Use it. Play whenever you have time. Consider it part of your duties if that makes it easier. The instrument needs to be played regularly to stay in good condition." "Thank you, sir." Her voice was barely a whisper, but Henri heard the emotion in it. Gratitude, yes, but also something more complex. Confusion, perhaps. Wariness. She was trying to understand why he was being kind to her, what he wanted in return. Henri left the room quickly, before he could say something he would regret, before he could tell her the truth that was burning in his chest like acid. He couldn't free her. Not yet. The legal process was complex, and any sudden manumission would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. But he could give her small dignities, small freedoms within the prison of her circumstances. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all he could do without destroying everything. Just when we thought we'd seen the full extent of the Dufresne family's secrets, the situation at Bellerive grows even more complicated. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next as Henri struggles with the impossible situation he's inherited. Spring arrived at Bellerive with the usual explosion of growth and activity. The sugarcane fields turned green almost overnight. The air grew thick with humidity that made every breath feel like drinking water, and the work of the plantation intensified. Henri threw himself into management with an almost desperate energy, trying to lose himself in the endless details of running a large agricultural operation. He met with the overseers daily, reviewing the work schedules and ensuring that the enslaved workers were being treated as humanely as the brutal system allowed. He inspected the fields, the equipment, the sugar mill that would roar to life during the harvest season. He reviewed the accounts, negotiated with buyers in New Orleans, and dealt with the 1,000 small crises that arose constantly on a plantation of Bellerive's size. But he couldn't escape the central problem of his life. Margot was everywhere, managing the household, overseeing the kitchen, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. And every time he saw her, every time he heard her voice or caught a glimpse of her profile, he was reminded of the impossible situation his father had created. The other house servants had accepted her authority quickly. She had a way of giving instructions that was firm but respectful, and she never asked anyone to do work she wouldn't do herself. Henri often saw her working alongside the other women, her sleeves rolled up as she helped with the laundry or the cooking, despite her position as head of the household staff. The field workers were more wary. They saw her as someone who had been elevated above them, who had been given privileges they would never enjoy. Henri heard whispers, saw the looks they gave her when she passed. There was resentment there, and he understood it. In a system where everyone was oppressed, any small advantage one person gained was seen as coming at the expense of others. In April, a letter arrived that changed everything. It came from New Orleans, from the law office of Beauregard and Associates. Henri opened it in his study, expecting some routine matter of business. A contract to review, a payment to authorize, some minor legal issue that required his attention. Instead, he found himself reading a document that made his blood run cold. "Dear Mr. Dufresne," the letter began in the formal, elaborate style that lawyers favored. "It is my duty to inform you of a matter concerning your late father's estate. that has recently come to light. Among the papers of my late partner, Mr. Alphonse Beauregard, who passed away last month, we have discovered a sealed document dated 1834, with instructions that it be delivered to Etienne Dufresne's heir, upon certain conditions being met. Those conditions have now been satisfied, and I am obligated by the terms of my late partner's agreement to forward this document to you. Please find it enclosed. If you have any questions regarding this matter, I remain at your service. Respectfully yours, Jean-Baptiste Moreau, Attorney at Law. Attached to the letter was a smaller envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax bearing his father's signet ring. The seal was unbroken, suggesting that no one had read the contents since his father had written them 13 years ago. Henri's hands shook as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. His father's handwriting stared back at him, strong and clear despite the passage of years. The ink had faded slightly, turning from black to brown, but the words were still perfectly legible. Henri, the letter began, and the use of his name rather than a formal address made Henri's stomach clench. His father had rarely addressed him by name in writing, preferring the formal, "my dear son," or simply, "sir." The intimacy of Henri suggested something personal, something his father had struggled to say. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and certain events have transpired that I hoped would never come to pass. I am a coward for not telling you this in life, but I find I cannot face my grave without ensuring that you know the truth, even if I lack the courage to tell you myself. In 1833, I met a woman named Celeste Dubois. She was enslaved, owned by a merchant who was settling his affairs before returning to France. I purchased her freedom, or so I told myself at the time. In truth, I purchased her, and in doing so I bound her to me as surely as any chain. She was educated, cultured, more refined than many white women of my acquaintance. She spoke French like a native of Paris, played piano beautifully, and had read more books than most men I knew. I told myself that I loved her. Perhaps I did in my way, but I loved my position more. I loved the respect of my peers, the security of my social standing, the comfort of my life at Bellerive. I loved what I had more than I loved her. When she told me she was carrying my child, I made a choice. I could have freed them both. I could have acknowledged my daughter, faced the scandal, and lived with the consequences. Instead, I established the house on Rue Dauphine. I provided for them financially. I visited when I could, which was not often enough. I convinced myself that this was enough, that this was a kind of love, that I was doing the best I could under difficult circumstances. It was not love. It was cowardice, dressed in the clothes of practicality. It was selfishness disguised as responsibility. Margot, my daughter, your sister, grew up knowing she had a father who would never claim her. Celeste never told her my name, but she knew I existed, knew I chose my legitimate family over her. I saw the knowledge in her eyes as she grew older, the understanding that she was a secret to be kept, a complication to be managed. I saw it, and I did nothing to change it. I am telling you this now because I fear what may happen after my death. The trust I established will end with Celeste's passing. I have made no provisions beyond that, because to do so would have required explanations I was not prepared to give. If Margot has been sold, if she has entered the system that I profited from all my life, then you must find her. You must free her. You must give her the life I was too weak to provide. This is not a request, Henri. This is a command from your father, and a plea from a man who knows he has failed in the most fundamental way a human being can fail. Make this right. Do what I could not. Be the man I should have been. I have left instructions with Beauregard to deliver this letter to you only if two conditions are met. First, that I am dead, and second, that Celeste has also passed away. If you are reading this, both of those conditions have been satisfied, and Margot is alone in the world, vulnerable to whatever fate may befall her. Find her, free her, give her the family she should have had from the beginning. Your father, Etienne Dufresne, Henri read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing fresh waves of emotion, anger, grief, disgust, and a terrible, crushing sense of responsibility. His father had known. He had known exactly what might happen, and he had done nothing to prevent it. He had written this letter 13 years ago, when Margot was 12, and then he had lived another 13 years without acting on it. 13 years in which he could have freed Margot himself, could have faced the consequences of his choices, could have done the right thing. Instead, he had died and left his son to inherit not just his wealth and property, but his sins. The worst part was the timing. The letter had been written 13 years ago when Margot was 12. His father had lived another 13 years after writing it, years in which he could have acted, could have freed Margot himself, could have faced the consequences of his choices. Instead, he had continued the arrangement, continued the payments, continued to visit the house on Rue Dauphine when business took him to New Orleans. And then he had died, leaving Henri to clean up the mess. Henri stood and walked to the window, the letter crumpled in his fist. Outside, the plantation was alive with activity. Enslaved workers moved through the fields, tending the young cane plants. The overseer rode among them on horseback, watching, supervising, ready to enforce discipline if anyone slacked in their work. It was a scene Henri had witnessed thousands of times, so familiar it had become invisible. But now he saw it differently. Every person in those fields was someone's son or daughter, someone's brother or sister. They all had stories, histories, families that had been torn apart by the system that enriched people like the Dufresnes. And Henri was part of that system. He benefited from it. He perpetuated it every day he remained at Bellerive. The thought made him sick. He returned to the desk and smoothed out the letter, reading it one more time. His father's words seemed to mock him from the page. Make this right. Do what I could not. But how? How was he supposed to make right something so fundamentally wrong? How was he supposed to give Margot the family she should have had when that family was built on slavery, when the very wealth that could provide for her came from the oppression of people just like her? There were no good answers. There were only choices, each one carrying its own weight of consequence. Henri spent 3 days deciding what to do. He could free Margot immediately, but that would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give. He could send her away with money and papers, but that felt like another abandonment, another man in her life choosing the easy path over the right one. He could tell her the truth. But what good would that do? What comfort would it bring to know that her brother owned her, that the family she had been denied was now her jailer? In the end, the decision was taken out of his hands. He was in the library late one evening. The letter from his father spread on the desk before him when he heard a soft knock at the door. Before he could respond, Margot entered, carrying a tray with coffee and brandy. It was her habit to bring him refreshments in the evening, a small service she performed without being asked. She set the tray down on the side table, then turned to leave. "Wait," Henri said, and she paused, her hand on the door handle. "Close the door." She did, her expression wary. Henri realized how this must look. The master calling a female slave to his private room late at night, ordering the door closed. The implications were obvious and sickening. He needed to clarify quickly before she could misunderstand. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice urgent, "and I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that?" Margot stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her, her face carefully blank. Henri recognized the posture now. It was armor, a way of protecting herself from whatever was coming. She had learned long ago that when masters wanted to talk privately, it rarely meant anything good. "I know who your father was," Henri began, and saw her flinch as if struck. "I know about the house on Rue Dauphine, about your mother, about the arrangement my father made. I know because I found his records. I found his letter." He pushed the yellowed paper across the desk toward her. "Read it." Margot didn't move. "Sir, I don't think—" "Read it." His voice was harsher than he intended, roughened by 3 days of sleeplessness and emotional turmoil. "Please, I need you to read it." She approached the desk slowly, as if walking towards something dangerous. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the letter. Henri watched her face as she read, saw the moment when understanding dawned, when the full weight of the revelation hit her. Her hands tightened on the paper, crumpling the edges. Her breathing became shallow, rapid. A single tear escaped and ran down her cheek before she could stop it. When she finished, she set the letter down carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles she had made. She looked at Henri with eyes that held a lifetime of pain, of questions, of grief that had nowhere to go. "You're my brother." Her voice was flat, emotionless, as if she were stating a simple fact rather than acknowledging a truth that changed everything. "Yes. And you've known since Christmas?" "Yes." She laughed then, a sound without humor, bitter and broken. It was a terrible sound, full of all the pain she had been holding back, all the grief and anger and betrayal that she had learned to suppress for survival. Of course you knew. You looked at me and saw the resemblance, just as I looked at you and saw my own face reflected back. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was seeing connections that didn't exist because I wanted them to exist. I told myself it was impossible, that fate couldn't be that cruel, but you knew. I didn't know what to do. Henri said helplessly. "I still don't know what to do. You could free me." The words were simple, direct, devastating in their clarity. "I will, I am. The papers are already being prepared. But Margot..." He stopped, realizing it was the first time he had used her name without the formal distance of "sir" following it. "I don't want you to just disappear. I don't want to be another man who abandons you." "What do you want then?" Her voice was sharp now, anger breaking through the careful control. "Do you want me to be grateful? Do you want me to forgive our father for keeping my mother as property, for keeping me as property, for choosing his comfort over our freedom? Do you want me to thank you for doing what should have been done the day I was born? What exactly do you want from me, Henri?" It was the first time she had used his name, and hearing it from her lips felt like a punch to the chest. They were siblings, connected by blood, and yet they were strangers. Worse than strangers, they were master and slave, owner and property, separated by a gulf that seemed impossible to cross. Henri struggled to find the words, to articulate something he barely understood himself. "I want to know you. I want to understand who you are, what you want, what your life could be if you had the freedom to choose it. I want to be your brother, not your master. I want to have the relationship we should have had from the beginning." "You can't be both," Margot said quietly, her anger fading into something sadder, more resigned. "As long as I'm enslaved, as long as I'm property, you can't be anything but my master. That's how this system works. That's what our father understood, even if he pretended otherwise. You can't own someone and love them. You can't hold someone in bondage and call it family." She was right, and Henri knew it. There was no middle ground, no way to have a genuine relationship while the fundamental inequality remained. He had been trying to find a comfortable compromise, a way to ease his conscience without fully confronting the horror of what he had inherited. "The papers will be ready in 2 weeks, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm freeing you completely, with enough money to establish yourself wherever you choose. New Orleans, if you want to return there, or somewhere else, somewhere new. The north, perhaps, where you'll be safer. The choice will be yours." "And then what?" Margot asked, her eyes searching his face. "Do we pretend to be strangers? Do we acknowledge the connection? What does it mean to be siblings when we've lived our entire lives in different worlds, when one of us owned the other, even if only for a few months?" Henri had no answer. The question was too large, too complex, touching on issues that went far beyond their personal situation. They were products of a system that made such relationships impossible, that drew lines between people based on the arbitrary circumstances of their birth and the color of their skin. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but I think we have to try to figure it out. We owe that much to ourselves, and to your mother. She wanted better for you. She died believing you would have a chance at something more than she had. Maybe we can honor that, even if we can't fix everything else. Margot's expression softened slightly at the mention of Celeste. She never spoke ill of him, you know. Our father. She never told me his name, but she never said a harsh word about him either. I think she loved him in spite of everything. Or maybe because of everything. I never understood it. How could she love someone who kept her enslaved? How could she forgive someone who chose his reputation over her freedom? Love is complicated, Henri said, especially when it exists within systems designed to make it impossible. Maybe she didn't forgive him. Maybe she just understood that he was weak, and she chose not to let his weakness destroy her. Yes. Margot moved to the window, looking out over the dark grounds. The moon was rising, casting silver light over the fields and the quarters where the enslaved workers lived. I used to imagine what it would be like to have a family. A real family, not just my mother and me in our little house, but brothers and sisters. A father who acknowledged me. A place where I belonged. I used to make up stories about them, about what they would be like, what we would do together. She turned back to Henri, and in the moonlight he could see tears on her cheeks. And now I find out I have a brother, and he's the man who owns me. The stories I told myself as a child never included that possibility. The pain in her voice was unbearable. Henri wanted to comfort her, to somehow make it better, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would change the fundamental wrongness of their situation. They were victims of their father's choices, trapped in a system neither of them had created, but both of them were forced to navigate. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing the words were inadequate. "I'm sorry for all of it. For our father's choices, for the system that made those choices possible, for the fact that we're meeting like this instead of how we should have met, as family, as equals, as people who had the freedom to choose what kind of relationship we wanted to have. Sorry doesn't change anything," Margot said, but her voice was gentler now, less angry. "But I suppose it's a start. It's more than our father ever gave my mother, more than most people in my position ever receive." They stood in silence for a long moment, two people connected by blood, but separated by everything else, trying to find some way forward through an impossible situation. 2 weeks, Henri said finally. "In 2 weeks you'll be free, and then we'll figure out what comes next. Together." Margot nodded slowly. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I've never had a brother before. I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I," Henri admitted. "But we'll learn. We have to." The 2 weeks before Margot's manumission papers were finalized passed in a strange limbo. She continued her work in the household, but the dynamic between her and Henri had shifted fundamentally. They were no longer master and slave, but they weren't yet siblings either. They existed in an undefined space, learning to navigate a relationship that had no template, no social script to follow. Henri found himself seeking her out, asking her opinions on household matters that he had previously handled alone. He discovered that she had insights into the running of the plantation that he had never considered. Ways to make the work more efficient, ways to treat the enslaved workers more humanely without sacrificing productivity. She had spent her entire life observing, learning, understanding systems from the perspective of someone who had no power within them. That perspective was valuable in ways Henri was only beginning to appreciate. Margot, for her part, seemed to relax incrementally, allowing glimpses of the person she might have been if she had grown up free. She was intelligent, perceptive, with a dry sense of humor that caught Henri off guard. Once, when he was complaining about a particularly difficult business negotiation, she said dryly, "Perhaps if you stopped trying to be reasonable and simply told them what you wanted, they would respect you more. Reasonable people are easy to manipulate." Henri had laughed, startled by her directness. "Is that what you think of me? That I'm too reasonable?" "I think you're trying to be a good person in a system that punishes goodness," she replied. "It's admirable, but it's also exhausting to watch." The comment had stung, but Henri recognized the truth in it. He was trying to be humane within an inhumane system, trying to find some moral high ground in a situation where no such ground existed. It was an impossible task, and Margot saw through it with the clarity of someone who had no illusions left. One evening they sat together in the library, a breach of protocol that would have scandalized anyone who witnessed it, and talked about their childhoods. Henri described growing up at Bellerive, the pressure of being the younger son, always in his brother's shadow, until Philippe's death had made him the heir. He talked about his education in New Orleans. The law practice he had been building before his father's death had called him back to the plantation. Margot talked about the house on Rue Dauphine, the careful balance her mother had maintained between dignity and survival. She described the education that had set her apart from other enslaved people, but had also made her situation more painful. "I could read Shakespeare," she said, "but I couldn't walk down the street without papers proving I had permission to be there. I could play Chopin, but I couldn't choose where I lived or who I associated with. The education my mother fought to give me just made me more aware of everything I was denied. Sometimes I wondered if ignorance would have been easier." "Do you resent her for it?" Henri asked. "For teaching you to want things you couldn't have?" Margot considered the question carefully, her eyes distant. "No. I think she was trying to give me the tools to survive, to maybe find a way to something better. She couldn't free me herself. She had no money, no power, no legal standing. But she could give me skills, knowledge, the ability to navigate different worlds. She was doing the best she could with what she had. I can't resent her for that." "Like our father," Henri said bitterly. "Doing the best he could, which wasn't nearly enough." "No," Margot agreed. "It wasn't enough. But I've learned that most people don't do enough. Most people choose comfort over justice, convenience over courage. Our father wasn't unusual in that regard. He was just human, weak, selfish, cowardly, but human." The generosity of her perspective shamed Henri. She had every right to be angry, to hate their father, and everyone who had participated in the system that had oppressed her. Instead, she had somehow found a way to understand, to see the humanity in people who had denied hers. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. Margot smiled, a real smile that transformed her face, making her look younger, less burdened. "I'm a survivor. That's different from being remarkable. Remarkable is a luxury I've never been able to afford. I've just learned to adapt, to find ways to preserve myself in situations designed to destroy me." On the day the papers were finalized, Henri called Margot to his study. The documents sat on his desk. Legal proof of her freedom, signed and sealed, ready to be filed with the parish records. He had also prepared a bank draft for $5,000, enough to establish her independently, to give her real choices about her future. It was a substantial sum, more than most free people of color could hope to accumulate in a lifetime. "It's done," he said, pushing the papers across the desk. "You're free." Margot picked up the documents with hands that shook slightly. She read through them carefully, her eyes moving over every line, every clause, as if searching for some hidden trap, some condition that would make the freedom conditional or temporary. When she finished, she set them down and looked at Henri with an expression he couldn't quite read. Relief, certainly, but also something more complex. Grief, perhaps, or the weight of possibility. "Thank you," she said simply. "Where will you go?" Henri asked, though he dreaded the answer. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the strange comfort of having family nearby even under such complicated circumstances. The thought of her leaving, of never seeing her again, filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. "I don't know yet. I need time to think, to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by my relationship to other people. I've been someone's daughter, someone's property, someone's responsibility my entire life. I want to find out who I am when I'm just myself, when I'm not performing a role for survival." Henri nodded, understanding even as his heart sank. "Will you stay in Louisiana?" "Maybe, maybe not. That's the beauty of freedom, isn't it? I get to choose. I get to decide where I go, what I do, who I become. It's terrifying and exhilarating at the same time." She stood, gathering the papers carefully, holding them as if they were the most precious things in the world. At the door she paused and turned back. "Henri," It was the first time she had used his name without the formal "sir," and hearing it felt like a gift. "Thank you for doing what our father couldn't. It doesn't erase the past, but it matters. It matters that you tried. It matters that you saw me as a person rather than property. It matters that you're trying to be better than the system you inherited." After she left, Henri sat alone in the study for a long time, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He had freed his sister, fulfilled his father's final command, done the right thing according to every moral standard he could imagine. So why did he feel like he had lost something irreplaceable? The answer, he realized, was that he had. He had lost the possibility of a normal sibling relationship, the chance to know Margot in the way brothers and sisters should know each other. They would always be marked by the circumstances of their meeting, by the fact that he had owned her, even if only briefly. That stain would never fully wash away, but perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps they should carry that weight, should remember what had been done to them and to so many others. Perhaps the discomfort was necessary, a reminder of the cost of the system they had both been born into. Margot left Bellerive 3 days later, on a morning when fog rolled in from the river and turned the world grey and indistinct. Henri watched from the gallery as she climbed into the carriage that would take her to New Orleans, her few possessions packed in a single trunk. She had refused his offer of more luggage, more clothing, more of anything. "I want to start fresh," she had said. "I want to choose everything myself, from my clothes to my furniture to the books on my shelves. I want everything in my life to be mine, chosen by me." She looked up at him before the driver set off, raised one hand in farewell, and then she was gone, disappearing into the mist like a ghost, like something that had never quite been real. The household felt empty without her. The other staff continued their work efficiently. Margot had trained them well in the brief time she had been at Bellerive, but something vital had been lost. Henri realized that Margot had brought a quality to the plantation that had nothing to do with her skills or efficiency. She had brought the possibility of redemption, the hope that the sins of the past could somehow be addressed, if not fully atoned for. Now she was gone, and Henri was left alone with his inheritance and his guilt. He threw himself into the work of the plantation, but his heart wasn't in it. He looked at the enslaved people who worked his fields and saw Margot in every face. He heard their voices and wondered what stories they carried, what families had been torn apart, what potential had been crushed under the weight of the system he perpetuated simply by existing, by maintaining Bellerive, by accepting the wealth that came from their labor. For the first time in his life, Henri truly understood what his wealth was built on. It wasn't just sugar and land and favorable market conditions. It was human suffering, multiplied across generations, normalized and legalized and defended by people who benefited from it. His father had been one of those people. His grandfather had been one of those people. And now Henri was too, no matter how much he tried to be different, to be better. The realization was crushing. He began to make changes at Bellerive, small at first, then gradually more significant. He reduced the work quotas, accepting lower profits in exchange for less brutal conditions. He ensured that families were kept together, refusing to sell anyone regardless of the financial incentive. He established a school where enslaved children could learn to read and write, hiring a free woman of color from New Orleans to teach them. His neighbors noticed, of course. They made comments about his softness, his impracticality, his dangerous ideas. Charles Beaumont, who had given him Margot as a Christmas gift, confronted him one evening over brandy. "You're being foolish, Henri," Charles said bluntly, his face flushed with alcohol and frustration. "Treating them like people will only make them dissatisfied with their lot. You're creating problems for yourself and for the rest of us. If your slaves start expecting to be treated well, ours will too. You're undermining the entire system." "They are people, Charles," Henri replied quietly. "That's not a matter of opinion. It's a fact. Of course they're people, but they're also property. That's the law. That's the way the world works. You can't change that by being soft." "The world changes," Henri said. meeting his friend's eyes steadily. Laws change. What seems permanent and natural in one generation becomes unthinkable in the next. Slavery won't last forever. It can't. Charles shook his head, setting down his glass with more force than necessary. You've become strange since your father died. I don't know what's gotten into you, but I hope you come to your senses before you ruin yourself. You're making enemies, Henry. People are talking. They're saying you're an abolitionist sympathizer, that you're dangerous. Let them talk, Henry said, though the warning sent a chill down his spine. In Louisiana in 1847, being labeled an abolitionist could be dangerous indeed. But he couldn't go back to the way things had been. He couldn't unsee what he had seen, couldn't unknow what he now knew. Henri didn't tell Charles about Margot. He didn't explain that his sister had been enslaved, that he had owned her, that the abstract moral questions Charles dismissed so easily had become painfully, personally real. Some truths were too dangerous to share, too likely to destroy the fragile social position he was trying to maintain, even as he worked to undermine the system that sustained it. In June, a letter arrived from New Orleans. Henri recognized Margot's handwriting immediately and tore it open with hands that shook. "Dear Henri," it began, and the simple intimacy of the greeting made his throat tight. "I am writing to tell you that I am well and settling into my new life. I have taken rooms in the French Quarter, in a boarding house run by a free woman of color who has been very kind to me. The freedom to make choices is still strange. I find myself sometimes waiting for permission to do things that I now have every right to do. But I am learning. I am becoming someone new, or perhaps I am becoming who I always was beneath the roles I had to play for survival. I have been thinking a great deal about our father, about the choices he made and the legacy he left us. I find that I cannot hate him, though perhaps I should. He was a man caught in a system that corrupted everyone it touched, and he lacked the courage to stand against it. That makes him weak, but not monstrous. Most people are weak when tested. Most people choose comfort over principle. But you, Henri, you had a choice and you made the right one. You could have kept me enslaved, could have maintained the secret, could have protected yourself and your position. Instead, you chose to do what was difficult and right. That matters. It doesn't fix everything, but it matters. I don't know what our relationship will be going forward. We are siblings, but we are also strangers, shaped by vastly different experiences. Perhaps we will find a way to know each other truly. Or perhaps we will remain distant, connected by blood but separated by history. Either way, I want you to know that I don't blame you for the circumstances of my birth or the years I spent in bondage. You inherited a terrible situation, and you handled it with more grace than I had any right to expect. Thank you for giving me my freedom. Thank you for seeing me as a person rather than property. Thank you for being the brother our father never allowed you to be. With affection and hope, Margot." Henri read the letter multiple times, each reading bringing a complex mixture of relief and sadness. She was safe. She was free. She didn't hate him. But she was also gone, living a life separate from his, and he had no idea if he would ever see her again. He wrote back immediately, a long letter in which he tried to express everything he had been feeling: the guilt, the anger at their father, the strange grief of discovering family only to lose them again. He told her about the changes he was making at Bellerive, about his growing discomfort with the system he was part of, about his uncertainty regarding what he should do with the knowledge and privilege he had inherited. Her response came a month later, and it contained advice that would change the course of his life. "You ask what you should do," she wrote. "I cannot tell you that. No one can make that choice for you. But I can tell you what I have learned, that we cannot change the past, but we can refuse to perpetuate it. You own 170 people, Henri. 170 human beings whose lives are in your hands. You cannot free them all without destroying yourself. I understand that. The economic and social consequences would be catastrophic, and you would likely be prevented from doing so by the courts anyway. But you can treat them with dignity. You can ensure they are not separated from their families. You can teach them to read, give them skills, prepare them for the day when this evil system finally ends. And it will end, Henri. It cannot last forever. You can be the master who makes slavery slightly less terrible, even as you work toward a world where masters are no longer necessary. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something, and something is better than nothing. Henri followed Margot's advice as best he could. He implemented changes at Bellerive gradually, carefully, in ways that wouldn't attract too much attention from his neighbors or the authorities. He ensured that families were kept together, refusing all offers to purchase individual workers regardless of the price offered. He established the school and made attendance mandatory for all children under 12, arguing to skeptical overseers that educated workers were more valuable. He reduced the brutal quotas that had driven the harvest season, accepting lower profits in exchange for less suffering. He improved the quarters where the enslaved workers lived, ensuring they had adequate food, clothing, and medical care. He stopped using the whip as punishment, instead implementing a system of privileges and restrictions that was less violent if no less controlling. His neighbors noticed, of course. They made comments about his softness, his impracticality, his dangerous ideas. Some stopped doing business with him. Others warned him that he was setting a bad example, that his workers would become spoiled and difficult to manage. A few suggested, not entirely in jest, that he might be an abolitionist sympathizer, which in Louisiana in the late 1840s was a serious accusation. But Henri persisted. He couldn't free the people he owned. The legal and economic barriers were too great, but he could make their lives slightly less terrible. He could prepare them for a future that he hoped would be different, even if he couldn't see how that future would arrive. He and Margot corresponded regularly. She had opened a small school in New Orleans, teaching free people of color and enslaved people whose masters permitted them to attend. It was dangerous work. Education was seen as a threat to the social order, and there were laws restricting what could be taught to enslaved people. But she pursued it with quiet determination, finding ways to work within the system while subtly undermining it. "I am teaching them what my mother taught me," she wrote in one letter. "That knowledge is power, that dignity is not something that can be granted or taken away by others, that they are fully human regardless of what the law says. It is small work, but it is my work. It is how I choose to live in the world our father made." Henri admired her courage, even as he worried for her safety. New Orleans was more tolerant than the rural parishes, but there were limits to that tolerance. A free woman of color who was too educated, too independent, too outspoken could find herself in danger quickly. The system had ways of punishing those who challenged it, subtle and not so subtle methods of enforcing conformity. His fears were realized in September of 1849, when he received a frantic letter from one of Margot's students. There had been a raid on the school by local authorities, acting on a complaint from someone who objected to enslaved people being taught to read. Margot had been arrested for teaching enslaved people without permission, for possessing abolitionist literature, for a dozen other charges that added up to the crime of being too free, too defiant of the social order. Henri traveled to New Orleans immediately, leaving Bellerive in the hands of his most trusted overseer. He used every connection he had, called in every favor, spent money he couldn't afford to spend. It took 3 days and cost him a substantial bribe to the right officials, but he finally got her out of the parish jail. She was thinner when he saw her, with bruises on her arms and a cut above her eye that was still healing. But her spirit was unbroken, her eyes still bright with determination. "I won't stop," she told him as they sat in a cafe near the river, speaking in low voices so as not to be overheard. "I can't stop. This is the only thing that makes sense to me, the only way I know to fight back against what was done to me, to my mother, to all of us." "You'll get yourself killed," Henri said bluntly, fear making his voice harsh. "Then I'll die free," Margot replied, meeting his eyes steadily. "That's more than my mother had, more than most people like me will ever have. I won't live in fear, Henri. I won't make myself small to make other people comfortable. I've spent too much of my life doing that already. Henri wanted to argue, to convince her to be more careful, to protect herself, but he knew it would be useless. She had found her purpose, her way of making meaning out of the suffering she had endured. He had no right to take that from her, even if it terrified him. "Let me help," he said instead. "Money, connections, whatever you need. Let me be useful." Margot smiled, and for a moment he saw the sister she might have been if they had grown up together, if the world had been different. "You're already useful, Henri. You're proving that people can change, that they can choose to be better than the systems they inherit. That matters more than you know. Every person you treat with dignity, every family you keep together, every child you teach to read, it all matters. You're planting seeds for a future you may never see, but that doesn't make the work less important." The years passed, and the country moved inexorably toward the conflict that everyone could see coming, but no one seemed able to prevent. The tensions between North and South grew more acute, the debates over slavery more heated, the possibility of compromise more remote. Henri continued his work at Bellerive, making small changes, treating the people he owned with as much dignity as the system allowed, preparing them for a future he hoped would be different. Margot continued her school, moving it frequently to stay ahead of authorities, teaching anyone who would learn. She had become known in New Orleans as someone who could be trusted, someone who would help enslaved people learn to read, who would provide papers for those seeking to escape, who would offer shelter to those in need. It was dangerous work, but she seemed to thrive on the danger, to find in it a purpose that gave her life meaning. They saw each other rarely. The social complications of their relationship made frequent contact difficult, and Henri's growing reputation as an abolitionist sympathizer made it dangerous for Margot to be associated with him too openly. But they wrote often, their letters becoming a record of two people trying to navigate an impossible situation, trying to be family, despite everything that separated them. In 1853, Margot wrote with news that surprised him. She was engaged to be married. The man was a free person of color, a carpenter named Thomas Laurent who had built up a successful business in New Orleans. From Margot's description, he was kind, intelligent, and supportive of her work. "I never thought I would marry," she wrote. "I never thought I would trust anyone enough to share my life with them. But Thomas sees me, truly sees me, not as property or as a symbol or as a problem to be solved, but as myself. He knows my history, knows about our father, knows about you. And he loves me anyway. It is a gift I never expected to receive." Henri traveled to New Orleans for the wedding, a small ceremony in a Catholic church in the French Quarter. He sat in the back, not wanting to draw attention to his presence, and watched his sister marry a man who looked at her with obvious love and respect. When she caught his eye during the ceremony, she smiled, and Henri felt something in his chest loosen, a knot of guilt and grief that he had been carrying since that Christmas morning 6 years earlier. After the ceremony, they spoke briefly in the courtyard. Thomas shook Henri's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, his eyes assessing Henri with the careful judgment of a man who had learned to read people for his own survival. "Thank you for coming," Margot said, her hand resting on Thomas's arm. "It means a great deal to me." "I wouldn't have missed it," Henri replied, and meant it. "I'm happy for you, truly happy." "I know." She squeezed his hand, a brief gesture of affection that would have been unremarkable between any other siblings, but felt precious and fragile between them. "And I'm grateful for everything you've done, everything you continue to do. You're a good man, Henri. Our father would be proud." Henri wasn't sure about that. He suspected his father would have been horrified by the choices Henri had made, by the way he had disrupted the careful arrangements that had kept Margot hidden and controlled. But it didn't matter what his father would have thought. What mattered was that Margot was free, happy, building a life on her own terms. That was enough. Henri returned to Bellerive and continued his work, watching the political situation deteriorate, knowing that the world he had grown up in was ending. When the war finally came in 1861, he was almost relieved. The tension of maintaining an untenable system, of trying to be humane within an inhumane structure, had been exhausting. The war years were brutal. Bellerive was occupied by Union forces in 1862, and Henri found himself in the strange position of welcoming the army that was destroying his economic livelihood. The enslaved people on his plantation were declared free by military order, and most of them left immediately, seeking family members who had been sold away, or simply wanting to experience what it meant to move freely through the world. Henri didn't try to stop them. He gave them what money he could spare, wrote letters of reference for those who wanted them, and wished them well. Some thanked him, acknowledging the ways he had tried to make their lives less terrible. Others left without a word, their silence more eloquent than any speech could have been, a reminder that no amount of kindness could erase the fundamental wrong of ownership. When the war ended in 1865, Bellerive was a shell of what it had been. The fields were overgrown, the machinery broken, the grand house showing signs of neglect that would take years and money Henri didn't have to repair. He sold most of the land, keeping only the house and a few acres around it, enough to live on modestly but not enough to maintain the lifestyle he had been born into. He was 49 years old, and the world he had known was gone. In 1868, 3 years after the war's end, Henri received a letter from Margot inviting him to visit her in New Orleans. She and Thomas had survived the war, though it had been difficult. Their school had been destroyed during the occupation, their home damaged, their savings depleted. But they had rebuilt, and the school was now operating openly, legally, teaching formerly enslaved people to read and write and navigate their new freedom. Henry took the train to New Orleans, traveling through a landscape that still bore the scars of war. Fields lay fallow. Buildings stood empty, and everywhere there were people trying to figure out what the new world would look like. The city itself was chaotic, full of soldiers and freedmen and carpetbaggers, everyone trying to carve out a place in the new order. Margot met him at the station, and Henri was struck by how much she had changed. She was 34 now, her face showing the marks of hard years, but there was a confidence in her bearing that had been absent before. She moved through the world like someone who belonged in it, who had every right to occupy space and make decisions and be heard. "Welcome," she said, embracing him without hesitation. The gesture was natural, unforced, the kind of greeting that siblings might exchange anywhere. It made Henri's throat tight. "Come see what we've built." The school was in a building that had once been a warehouse, converted into classrooms and a small library. It was full of students of all ages, from children to elderly people, who had spent their entire lives enslaved and were now learning to read for the first time. Thomas was teaching a class on mathematics, his voice patient as he explained fractions to a group of attentive adults. "This is what freedom looks like," Margot said, watching her students with obvious pride. "It's messy and difficult and uncertain, but it's real. These people are building lives for themselves, making choices, learning skills. They're becoming who they were always meant to be." Henri felt tears prick his eyes. "Your mother would be proud." "Yes," Margot agreed, her voice soft. "She would. And so would our father, I think, despite everything. He wanted this for me. He just didn't have the courage to make it happen himself. But in the end, his weakness led to something good. It led to you freeing me, which led to this school, which is changing lives every day. Sometimes good things come from bad beginnings." They spent the afternoon walking through the city, talking about the past and the future, about the country that was trying to rebuild itself from the ashes of war. Margot told him about her plans to expand the school, to create more opportunities for freedmen who were struggling to establish themselves in a society that still viewed them with suspicion and hostility. "Will you help?" she asked as they stood on the levee, watching the Mississippi roll past. "I know you don't have much left, but whatever you can spare, money, connections, advice, it would make a difference." "Of course," Henri said without hesitation. "Whatever I have is yours. It always has been." Margot smiled and took his hand, a simple gesture that felt profound. "We're family, Henri. Really, truly family." Not because the law says so, but because we choose to be. That's what freedom means, the ability to choose who we are and who we love. As the sun set over the Mississippi, turning the water gold and orange, Henry realized that this was what redemption looked like. Not a single dramatic gesture, not a moment of perfect clarity, but a long, difficult process of making better choices, of trying to repair what had been broken, of building something new from the ruins of the past. He had inherited his father's sins, but he had also inherited the opportunity to do better. And with Margot's help, with her courage and vision and refusal to be defined by what had been done to her, he was learning how. It wasn't enough to erase the past. Nothing could do that. The years Margot had spent enslaved, the suffering of the hundreds of people who had worked at Bellerive, the countless families torn apart by the system, none of that could be undone. But it was something. And as Margot had written to him years ago, something was better than nothing. They were siblings, finally, in the way they should have been from the beginning. Not master and slave, not owner and property, but two people connected by blood and choice, working together to build a world where the horrors they had experienced would become impossible. It was a small victory in a country still struggling with the legacy of slavery. But it was their victory, earned through pain and courage, and the refusal to accept that the past had to determine the future. And in the end, that was all anyone could do. Take the broken pieces they had been given and try to build something better. The story of Henri and Margot Dufresne ended not with perfect resolution, but with hope. And sometimes, in a world as broken as theirs had been, hope is enough. This mystery shows us that the darkest secrets often lie not in supernatural forces, but in the choices people make and the systems they perpetuate. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in Louisiana's past? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. See you in the next video.